perfect. So okay, when we think about this issue, um, Noam Chomsky, who has been the guru of progressive thinking for 40 years now, for some subjects, his logic was, yeah, some subjects which are delicate should not be a priority in the agenda. And I think we have been guilty of doing that for many years. And of course, like the commandments of the progressive intellectual are that by definition there is no difference in implication on delinquency. These differences are all created by the social reaction. But then when you start studying, you realize that that would be perfect in a perfect world, in an imaginary world. But in practice, there are differences. And the bad decision, I think, is not to talk about these issues, because that was done for many years. And then the discourse was taken by the extremists. I would, in this case, is right-wing extremists that will take the discourse and present it in their way. And if we do not use data to clarify the discussion, then we are lost. So I think that is the main contribution of Space. It shows the situation, and then the interpretations can be done on the basis of these results. So first thing that I would like to show you is the distribution of foreign inmates in the prison population. I took 2015, but there is no big difference about this. And okay, what is a foreigner? I've been studying this issue also from a different point of view, being myself descendant of immigrants and being somehow an immigrant myself. And so there is sometimes a confusion about the notion of foreigners and immigrants. So an immigrant is the person who wants to establish in a country, arrives to the country, and has the possibility of establishing there. And this, we have tried in Space to measure that by the issue of the residence permit. But not all the countries collect data on that. And then foreigner is someone who doesn't have the nationality of the country, and that's all. Then, of course, in the former Soviet Union, there was a difference in nationalities, and we will see the case of Estonia, for example. But basically, the rule is if you don't have the passport of the country, you are considered as a foreigner. And then, so when we study distribution of foreigners, these two categories are often mixed. And this creates a lot of confusion. And usually what is true is that for people who are established in the country, usually we know, especially the first generation, the ones that arrive, are seldom overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And this, we know it for a specific, is evidence-based, so there are studies on that. On the contrary, for the largest category, which include every foreigner, the situation is quite different. So when you look at the map of Europe, and you see the darker the color, the higher the number of foreigners, you see a line that is quite impressive because it roughly goes over the older Iron Curtain. When you go through that, you can see it immediately, with a few exceptions in the Balkans, which are multinational states by definition, and we know what happened in the Balkans, so I'm not going to enter there. But otherwise, the problem is mainly presented in the problem. The highest percentages, are in what used to be called largely Western Europe, which is in fact also part of Central and Western Europe. In the islands, Great Britain and Ireland, the percentage is lower. So this is a fact. These countries are the most affluent in in Europe, the richer countries, and this seems to attract foreigners which are not necessarily immigrants. But for example, in Switzerland, we know that some of the foreigners that are in prison belong to organized groups that enter the country just to commit crimes. It has nothing to do with the discourse of the extreme political right about foreigners being integrated or not. That is a different discourse, and yeah, this is particular to each country and its own history of colonization or not colonization. But when we look at these figures, we must not forget that it is not reflecting really immigration, but just foreign nationals. So the distribution is clear, and it is in Western Europe. This is almost a non-issue in let's say in Eastern Europe, where the percentages are lower than 5%. So it is a Western problem. And when you look at probation, you see that many countries cannot provide data on the percentage of foreigners, probably because it is not an issue, for example, in Eastern Europe. And also in Western Europe, for a reason that Daniel mentioned, it's much difficult, it's quite difficult for a non-national to access to probation because they're not established in the country. So logically, you have, usually simplifying a little bit things, you have half the number of probationers in probation than in prison. And in many countries, it's much lower, the percentage. But it's interesting to look at these two together, and we are continuing to collect data, and we published a specific report from 2005 to 2015, and we plan to update it to 2020. So using these spark line models, which just show the minimum, the maximum, and the trend, they do not represent the real figures, but just the trend. You see the countries in probation, where the biggest increases were observed, or the biggest changes were observed. You see them in red are the increases, like 55% in Austria, 70% in Bulgaria, a huge increase in Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. We are including the 12 countries that answered, and this means including Iceland, who has a population of 300,000 persons, which means that the rates are quite unstable. And of course, when you take Monaco, they usually have 1, 2, 3 detainees. So this is not reliable, but they are members of the Council of Europe, and I have no reason to exclude them. But you must be aware of that. And when we look at inmates, the biggest increases also in Armenia and Finland, and you see a huge decrease in Estonia, which is a particular situation to which I will come back. So these are percentages. And one thing that one must really be careful when studying this is just a summary of what I've said before, so I will not pass a lot of time, is that the percentage of foreigners is not necessarily a good indicator, especially when prison populations are changing fast. So for example, I have included this example of the Netherlands, and you see here, there are two axes in this presentation. Here to the left, you have the percentage of foreign inmates, and this is measured here, the percentage in the right. So you see 20%. As Thijs said, the Netherlands have roughly 20%. In this case, I'm presenting until 2015 because it was clear. But when you see the evolution, so it passes from 23 to 20%. But if you look at the absolute numbers, which are here in blue, the decrease is quite important in the number of foreign inmates, but you don't see it in the percentage. Why? Because the prison population is going down. And in order to have the same percentage, this decrease should be the same among foreign citizens and among nationals. And this is seldom the case. So here, The prison population of the Netherlands was going down, as we saw in the presentation made by Melanie. But the number of nationals was going down at a faster pace than the number of foreigners. So it means that both go down, but one goes a little bit slower, so the percentage increases. And this may create some confusion, because in some cases, the numbers could be going down, but the percentage could be increasing. Something similar happened during World War II with the imprisonment rates of women. Many researchers looking only at the percentage said, you see, during the war, the percentage of women increased, and they made some conclusions about engagements in civil society and gender roles. But in fact, the real issue is that the men were mobilized, and so if they committed a crime, they were judged by the military code. So the percentage of women was increasing because there were less men being sent to prison. And this is exactly the same. There are less nationals in the stock. There are also less foreigners, but the decrease is not the same. And so the percentage changes. You see something similar, for example, here in Catalonia, where the number of foreign inmates increased until 2011, started decreasing. This is related to what I already said about the change in the law, and also is related to the economic crisis, which attracted less people. But you see the percentage is almost stable, because the number of nationals is going down at a much faster pace than the number of foreigners. So we must be very careful, but we have the time is limited, so I will concentrate on percentages, knowing that there could be a distortion, a bias. So, for example, let's concentrate only in the countries that show an increase. And you see, for example, we see an increase in Armenia. This graph is interesting because you see in red the foreigners in probation, and in blue the foreigners in prison. You see what I mentioned at the beginning. The percentage is much higher in prison. But as I mentioned also before, in outside of Western Europe, this issue of the foreigners represents only 5% of the population. So this is these are the median values, and the median values of foreigners in probation, and here the median values of foreigners in prison. Here you could see it's roughly 20%, 25% in 2019, compared to less than 10%. So it's 1.5 times higher, 2.5 times higher in prison than on probation. So this is the case of Armenia. Very similar is the case of Bulgaria. You see an increase. You see that, again, there are less people, there are less foreigners in on probation than in prison. But again, the percentages are very low. This is below 3%. When you move to other countries, Estonia is a very interesting country, because there's always the issue of the Russian-speaking minorities that did not take the nationality. And you see here, until 2010, for prison, which is again in blue as in all the previous ones, they were counting these persons that doesn't have a nationality in principle as foreigners, and the percentage was 40%. Then in 2011, they changed the way of counting, and they did not include them, and it goes down to 7%. And this remains more or less the same until 2017, but then suddenly in 2019, the national correspondent changed the way of counting, and then we go again to 35%. So these are the kind of things that we would like to improve when we create the longitudinal series, because this is the kind of things that maybe we don't see them, especially in the moment when we're collecting thousands of figures. But here it is clear that this is related clearly to the definition. On probation, this problem never arrived, because probably they were already counting these persons. This explains why you have more foreigners in probation than in prison, because they are counting as foreigners, persons living in Estonia, but that don't have the nationality of Estonia. These are mainly Russian minorities. They were being counted, and that explains this different trend observed only in Estonia. So behind all the figures that we present are the methodological explanations, and that is why all the figures in the space are accompanied by comments, which are lengthy to read, but you cannot use the figures without that.
So I'm sorry, Marcelo, if I could
I'll wrap it up. Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Yeah. Then, two more cases. Like this is Austria. Is again more or less the same trend, and Denmark is quite interesting because you see a huge increase in the use of probation, reaching 9%. And this one of the things that you could take out of these presentations is concentrating the exceptions to see what is going on. Maybe this could be a good example, Denmark, to look what's going on probation there. There was a change in the law in 2012-13 regarding foreigners in prison, but we see at the same time this increase on probation, which deserves to be studied. And this is Finland. And just to finish with the riddle, because I think also Luisa mentioned the issue of suicides. One unattended result of our study, published in one of these two booklets that Luisa mentioned. And we are now presenting also not only the reports, but one booklet about presenting the results of space in a more narrative way, and also one specific for a space and one in which we compare both, because of course a prison population rate can be interpreted rather easily. A very high prison population rate is not a good indicator, but the high probation population rate, what does it mean? It's not so easy to interpret. So this is death of inmates compared to deaths of persons on probation. And as you see, with a few exceptions, France being one of them and Serbia, everywhere the deaths of probationers are much higher than the deaths of inmates. And it's an issue that is seldom discussed. Of course, there are three potential explanations. If you are ill, then maybe you're put on probation and then you die. By the end of your time, maybe the environment of the prison compared to liberty may be less dangerous, which is this we can discuss. And there is the issue of suicides. What is happening? Are we having more suicides on probation? These are the results from last year, and so in this year, Space 1 and 2, we asked the question of suicides of persons on probation, but not a single country have information on that topic. So it would be impossible to see also the distribution about among foreigners and nationals. But it is striking to see this result, and nobody has paid a lot of attention to it. So that is what I wanted to say.
Marcelo, thank you so much to you and your team. I fear we've just only scratched the surface. We could revisit this, and I think we'll discuss that in the group. It's very important that we look at these comparisons. And just two comments. There are some indications, you mentioned suicide and self-harm, that during the COVID period, foreign nationals have been disproportionately represented in suicide and self-harm in at least one prison service. So, I mean, that is an area which does need to be looked at, as well as the impact on foreign national numbers due to the restrictions on travel, etc. Anyway, thank you all the presenters.